before we start, we always have a quiz, and we can start by naming the top 3 countries that you think have received the most significant amount of humanitarian aid. You can just shout out your answers. Top 3 countries that you think receives the most humanitarian aid.
Ever or this year?
Ever?
Ever.
Well, this year is hard. Maybe like just in general, like
Afghanistan.
no.
No.
Surprisingly, no. Yeah, Sudan is one of them. South Sudan. Yeah. 1 point for this
Well
table.
done,
Yay!
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. No.
Historic.
No. Yes, Yemen. 2 points! Are you so good at this topic?
No pressure. You're gonna
No
get the
pressure.
third one right now.
Yeah.
It's the UNHCR.
Yeah, I know. Are you getting answers?
You work for the grand.
Yeah. She's applying for a job now. And the third one is Syria. Yeah, so Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan. Yeah. Okay, so obviously there are a few programs that contribute humanitarian aid. There are a couple of agencies. So one of them is like UNHCR. There are 2 others. One is UNICEF and one is WFP. Can anyone decipher these acronyms? World Food Program, yeah, that's right, WFP, World Food Program. And UNICEF, we see it on the plane all the time. Contribute to UNICEF. What does UNICEF stand for?
No Googling.
Okay, UNICEF stands for UN Children's Fund. Yeah, I know. So funny, right? It's like, why is it UNICEF? But yeah, anyway. Okay, so we do have, actually we prepared like a mentee quiz, but I think we couldn't quite get it to load, so doesn't matter, but we'll do it this way instead. What do you think of when you think of humanitarian aid? Yeah, like just anything.
Just shout out your answers.
Yeah, what do you think?
Money.
Money.
Good one.
Yeah, money, yes.
Medicine.
Medicine.
Yeah.
Perishable items.
Perishable items like food.
Natural disasters.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Natural disasters. Yep.
Tents.
Tents.
Tent, shelter,
Tents, yeah,
yes.
shelter. Yeah, that's very important. Refugees. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, those are like just a couple of things that we think of. There are also other things like first responders, cargo, recovery kits, medicines, and governments are very important in humanitarian aid. So who do you think are the first responders in a disaster? In disaster.
British Army.
Yes. And
Maybe local government, I guess.
local governments, yeah. Yeah.
Red Cross.
Red Cross, yeah.
Okay.
So the regular ones are like, yeah, so obviously your firefighters, your nurses, the police, the local police, yeah, and all these other agencies that will come in. So will you, oh, okay, maybe we'll skip this. Aid needs to be delivered. How much do you think delivery cost represents the cost of aid? Is it 25%? 50%? So 50? 75%? Oh, you don't know. You think it's 50?
You think it's 50? Okay.
50? Any other guesses? What do you think the answer is, Claire? Go for it. I don't know what the answer is.
Okay, so I'm going to go one by one. The reason why we asked the question, what do you think of when you think of humanitarian aid? All the answers were correct, except there was one missing answer, which is the delivery of aid. So people always forget about the actual delivery of the aid. Number 2, the question was, who are the first responders in a disaster? So typically, whoever is there, they're actually the first to respond, which means that local businesses are also first responders. Okay, so I was a former journalist. I can tell you that in some of the terror attacks that we covered, for example, the Bali bomb, the first responders were the hotels donating their bed sheets because there's so many people injured they didn't have enough stretchers nor bandages. So they actually donated the bed sheets both for the living and obviously to take away the dead. So local businesses are also first responders. So the reason why I'm asking all these questions is that lots of things that you actually don't think about when disasters happen. And in terms of the delivery of aid, so an actual survey by a logistics company in a delivery of aid, and I'm going to ask Jonathan afterwards to share his experience. You will have to pay for either the flights for the passengers, you have to pay for the cargo to be shipped, warehousing costs, trucking costs, storage if you need to be stored, especially if medicine needs to be chilled and so forth. So an astonishing 73%
Oh,
of the cost of aid.
that's what.
Okay, you probably haven't thought about this, and this is why Airlink was formed, to take this load off NGOs. So Airlink relies on aviation assets. We work with our airline partners and logistics partners to take this burden off NGOs. NGOs are already under-resourced and underfunded. So imagine if, okay, give me a hands up. Like if you were to form an NGO today, what would you like it to be in? There's food, shelter, WASH, which is water, sanitation, hygiene, medicine, first responders, search and rescue. Just put up a hand. If you were to form an NGO today, what would you do?
Wow. Okay.
Probably like water and sanitation.
Yeah.
Water and sanitation, well done, okay?
Yeah, same.
Who else?
Food?
Huh? Food, okay. So imagine the two of you, you're going to start an NGO and you're going to look for funders. By some miraculous means, you raise $1 million. If you do, please tell me. If you raise $1 million, okay, imagine 730,000 actually goes into the delivery of the food or the sanitation items that you want to deliver. All right? And then you post it on social media, all right? And then you look at the tiny little pallet that arrived and your funder says to you, but I gave you $1 million. Is that all that we bought? It's like, yes, I could only spend 270,000 because the rest was on the delivery of it. So the cost of delivery of aid is so high that Airlink could step in and using our relationships with airline partners and logistics partners, try to take that burden off you. What is that burden? Last year, we helped 92 NGOs save $8.8 million.
Oh, wow.
That is $8.8 million more of food, water supplies, hygiene products, shelter, medicine, psychosocial support, all these other things that they could spend on because that's what they specialize in doing. Okay? So that was the reason we asked those questions, because I think we want to frame the conversation so that we think of the whole picture of what happens when disaster strikes and what does disaster response look like. So I'm going to ask you a next question. Which region do you think is the most prone to disasters? Okay, so I'll give you the example, right? You can just shout out Middle East, Africa, North America, Central America, South America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australasia, or Europe. Which region has the most disasters?
Like natural
The
disasters
most.
or human?
Natural
I would
disasters.
think Southeast.
Southeast Asia?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Natural disaster.
South Asia?
Yes. Is that your answer as well?
South Asia.
South Asia.
South Asia. Okay, all right.
Flooding, yeah.
So yeah, actually that will bring us to the next conversation. I'll actually give you the exact number once I scroll through this. So you're absolutely right, Asia and the Pacific, because we are on the ring of fire. So the numbers would be, there are 452 volcanoes around this region. So it's actually Southeast Asia and then all the way up to Japan and then down to South America. But more than 75%, more than 3/4 of those volcanoes, the active volcanoes, are on our side, the Southeast Asian side. And 90% of earthquakes around the world happens around the ring of fire. On top of that, Southeast Asia has the most densely populated areas. So when there is a disaster like that, that's why the numbers are pretty high. Let me just try and pull out the numbers. So over the last 10 years, in East Asia and the Pacific, The disasters and conflicts alone accounted for 34% of the displaced populations affected by conflicts and disasters. That gives you a real scale of it. Most of it would be in the Philippines, number 1, number 2 in China, and number 3 in Indonesia. Okay? So you may not have expected that, for our scale, our geography, that's 34% of it. For South Asia, it's 14%.
14.
So between the 34 and 14%, more than half is in our region, okay? That's led by India. These numbers did not include the recent Pakistan floods, so the numbers have changed. But it's led by India and, of course, Afghanistan. Okay? So this is to give you a sense that of all the regions in the world, that's why we're very active in this part of the world. We can talk a little bit about the history of aid, but the most important thing I want to talk about is the stitching of the logistics of aid. So there are a whole bunch of you here. So assuming that you're interested in providing medical care, right? You're interested in providing water, sanitation, and hygiene products, food, shelter. Well, you're all in different countries. You're all NGOs in different countries, but you're all responding to, let's say, the Turkish earthquake. Right? What we do in Airlink is we put out a call, who is responding, and we aggregate. We try to find out the city pairs where it makes sense. So I got to ship it from your country to somewhere, either in Turkey itself or somewhere close enough where we can truck it over. Because in the Turkey-Syria case, quite clearly, there was a lot of damage to the infrastructure. So airports were affected. I think there were quite a few airports that were closed. The tarmac was cracked. So first of all, to get aid in there. And then when aid got in there, quite quickly, I might add, what everyone realized was it was very hard to truck it out because the roads were damaged. So on the ground, the Turkish people realized that they had to repack into smaller trucks, and therefore there's a shortage of smaller trucks to respond. So these are all the issues that we have to think about when we're thinking of a response. How about Airlink? Airlink was formed after an earthquake in Haiti in 2010.
Right, yeah.
And the aviation sector realized, so it's a private sector response, the aviation sector realized that all these public donations and so forth were piling up. And instead of helping, you're creating a secondary disaster now. Aid is not moving from the airport, and aid that doesn't move, the medicines will spoil, the food will grow mold. So instead of helping the people you intend to help, you're actually creating a burden for them. So I'll give an example. Like without fail, when we speak to NGOs, we ask them, how can we help you? They'll actually say, stop. Please don't send us aid. You're creating more problems than you're helping us. Okay? So if you have a phone right now, type in donateresponsibly.org. Can you do that for me?
Okay.
Donateresponsibly.org.
What is that?
This was created by the World Food Programme in response to the problems that the Pacific Islanders were having when aid kept coming in. All right? And you will see you have a choice of things you want to send. Okay, so go and choose the items you want to send according to that website. And you will find out the cost of what you're sending is nothing compared to the cost of actually sending them there. So I have a very good example recently. Obviously, you saw the response for the Turkey earthquake when everyone was giving donations. There were so many donations, I'm sure you saw in the news, that they had to spend time sorting it out at the Turkish embassy and then shipping it on. That's time that we could have spent on other more important things, right? As Ryan will tell you, there are a lot of agencies out there and NGOs out there willing to respond. And they specialize in all these things that you already spoken about. They are prepared, and we aggregate them and we send them. We have medical NGOs, for example, that are able to secure donated or discounted medical supplies, and they can send it, they can aggregate, tell us, it's all packed, ready to go. And because they're experienced in it, they can tell us the delivery requirements, the temperatures, and of course, medicine is a regulated item, how to handle it, the approvals needed to get it to another country, right? and how to get it to the communities that are affected. So we prefer to work with vetted NGOs that know what they're doing, and they already specialize, that's what they do. Usually they are either for-profit or non-profit, but that's all that they do, okay? So what we prefer to do, obviously, is to work with them. We work with more than 150 NGOs worldwide, and we work with more than 90 airlines around the world to make sure that all these goods are reach the place that they meant to, and therefore help people. So we always say, aid is not aid until it arrives. It needs to be the right aid. It needs to arrive at the right place, and it needs to get there at the right time. And one of the most important things NGOs tell us is, even if it's the right aid is relevant aid. But even if it's the right aid, it's no longer relevant if it doesn't arrive on time. And a lot of times what you will hear happening is the aid has arrived and it's sitting in the airport. Okay? I actually have a graphic here. I can show it to you guys later on. It literally shows after a hurricane, people shipped in pallets of bottled water because water has been contaminated, right? 8 months later, they're still on the tarmac. In fact, they're blocking the tarmac. If anything, it'd be far more effective to send water filters, right? In the case of Tonga and in the Tonga earthquake, and there's an undersea earthquake and tsunami, what happened was people sent power generators, but no one checked with the local community, and it was a wrong voltage, so it could not be used. We spent all this money bringing in the generator. We didn't spend any money trying to get it out because it's just sitting there now and actually being a burden to the community. Am I right? So when we talk about the logistics of aid, these are the things that we think about. Because we came from the aviation industry, we understand regulated industries very well, right? So we will think through, we'll make sure we ask our NGOs, these medicines, are they requested? Have they been approved? Do you have a certification? And just because a medicine is approved in one country doesn't mean it's approved in another country. And then how do you regulate the use of it? If it's not used properly, how do you then dispose of it? So all these are questions that need to be asked in the whole logistics of aid. Now, if I were to ask you the next question, you guys had said just now, what's the best thing to donate? What's your answer?
Money.
Exactly. Money is the best thing to donate, right? So what happened in the Turkey-Syria earthquake, which we saw, and I did know in my own circle as well, people took out their credit cards, ran down to Decathlon and bought a whole bunch of things, tents, whatever, winter clothes and so on and so forth. And then it's now this huge volume of clothes, donations that need to be sent over there, And some people have this huge package and it says, to the people of Turkey. Like, who exactly would be there to receive this item and where is it meant to go? By the way, they have decathlons over there in Turkey too. If you had donated the money to them, they could have bought it there and trucked it over there much faster than now us trying to sort it out. Right? Some winter jackets have lights, don't they? In the collars and stuff like that. Well, guess what? We now have to check. Is there batteries in there? Because they have to be removed. They can't go in. So we encounter this all the time. And any of these impediments slow down the delivery of aid. What's the most important thing about aid is that you want to get to the people. They have survived the original disaster. You do not want them to die from a lack of medicine, food, and clean water, obviously. So everything needs to get there and get there quickly. And the fastest way to get there, number one, is cash, because they can buy things also within the local community. And people always forget the local community, the local businesses are also victims. But if the money is spent within the local economy, the area that's affected, it actually helps the recovery much faster and the resilience much faster. So there are different stages of a disaster response. So there's obviously the first 72 hours is critical. And then obviously all the NGOs that we work with will bring in whatever is necessary. But then over time, it is actually favorable that if anybody wants to donate cash because you actually help the recovery. On our part, for example, because of the relationships that we have built, we are actually able to send people very quickly. In the case of Turkey, the first responders were there within 11 hours. That's quite a remarkable number. And we also obviously look at the long-term recovery. So there are actually a lot of NGOs that we're working with that already have, if I'm not mistaken, 139 tons of goods all ready to go, but we need to pay for the logistics of aid. Okay, so we actually, I think it's about 2 million at the moment that we need in order to send the aid, to the victims of the Turkish-Syria earthquake. In other programs, for example, we're trying to raise 2.5 million, to send aid to Afghanistan over a 12-month period. Right? So these are just some of the examples of disasters and responses. In terms of what Daphne was saying, there are obviously more and more climate change disasters and climate change refugees. What we are seeing, obviously there are the usual cycles, monsoons, typhoons, and so forth, but what we're seeing is that they're getting harder and harder to predict. So in the case of 2022, the monsoon seasons were not starting and ending like traditional periods. So it was harder to predict, which means that we have to think about food security in terms of the harvest, in terms of the planting, as well as the harvesting and the storage. We all know about the historic floods in Pakistan. More than a tenth of the country was actually flooded. And therefore, it was very challenging. If you look at the unprecedented floods in Australia and in New Zealand, these are places that are more used to dealing with bushfires. They're not necessarily as responsive when it comes to floods. In the case of Cyclone Freddy, it's the only one of 4 cyclones that's been tracked in history that completed its journey from northeast Australia right across the Indian Ocean to Africa. Most cyclones would weaken at sea, in the open sea, they cool down, and then that's it. But with climate change, because the oceans are warmer, they pick up strength and they pick up speed. And we actually we were looking at Cyclone Freddy, and instead of weakening, it picked up speed. And so all the NGOs were getting together on the logistics cluster calls and saying we anticipate it's going to hit Madagascar. So thankfully, goods were brought in earlier, pre-positioned, and then the cyclone made landfall.
Oh, wow.
So thankfully, the goods were already in country because the airports and seaports were down, but the goods were already in country. We expected that to stop. Cyclone Freddy then kept going. It went through Mozambique, but it picked up speed again and strength, and it hit Malawi. So this is quite an unprecedented cyclone. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu in March the 1st, they were hit by Cyclone Judy. And March the 4th, they were hit by Cyclone Kevin. Also unprecedented, 2 cyclones within 4 days. And in between, they had a 6.3 earthquake. Does anyone know where Vanuatu is?
Yeah. So
What's the population of Vanuatu?
I don't know.
320,000 people living on 80 islands. It's a huge challenge trying to get aid out there and to respond quickly enough because it's so far and so remote. So these are the challenges when it comes to aid. So when the organizations in aid come together, it's not just response that we are dealing with. We are dealing with preparation and then trying to mitigate them. So for example, in the case of Mongolia where there's been a drought, again unprecedented, there was a lot of preparation because there was not enough animal feed and the flocks were dying. So you're preparing more for feed, you're preparing more to sustain the animals so that they will not be having food insecurity. The reason you've not read about it is this preparation meant that it was successful, it was not an unmitigated disaster, and the communities were therefore resilient. So those are the things, a few topics that we talk about when it comes to aid and the logistics of aid. And this is not really a presentation, this is more of a conversation So I did want to invite others to come and talk about this, and I have Jonathan Howe, who is from Relief SG, and I'd like him to come up and tell us a little bit.
Come.
So we have more than 150 partners. We just started in Asia Pacific. Relief
What,
SG is one of those NGOs that we have just signed on. And Jonathan here has himself been to Turkey. He went to Adana. I believe he was twice, right? In Gaziantep as well.
No, I wasn't at Gaziantep.
Okay. So he's going to tell you a little bit of the
just-
challenges that he had.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to pass this to you. That's more for recording.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just hold it.
This is for the recording, so you need to. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'm put on record. Yeah, we went to Adiyaman, Antakya, and what's the other place? Kahramanmaraş. So those are the earthquake hit areas. There were 10, right? 10, yeah, so we sent water filters over there. It was bad. We were there going around taking photographs also, and also talking to people on the ground, NGOs, the victims themselves. They were ordinary people, living in places. Some were a bit more affluent, some were poor areas, but they all had one thing in common. Their houses were damaged, and there were people living in tents. We had children, picking up from the tents and looking at us. And one thing we did was we actually brought almost 1,000 postcards with us, and this came from Geylang Methodist School Primary. And they had actually got the students to draw on postcards, greetings, and words of encouragement. And they were looking for an NGO to bring this over to pass it to the people there. And they contacted us, and we actually said, okay, we'll bring it along with us, and we'll try our best to distribute them. Because our main mission was to distribute and deploy the water filters. Yeah, so, but we did it, and we managed to start distributing to the children.
Can you talk a little bit about the water filters?
Water filters, okay.
Singapore company.
Okay, yeah. So there are many suppliers around the world, right? And even in Singapore, there are a couple of water filter suppliers. But being Singaporeans, and we are here, and we decided to since it's a local company that has produced a water filter, so why let's work with them. In fact, actually, we worked with Water Room years ago. 2014. We were incorporated in 2014, and they were also started about the same time. Water Room. Has anybody heard of Water Room? No. Okay. Good. So now you know about Water Room. Yeah. So around the same time, 2014, they were incorporated, and in fact, we were one of the first NGOs that they reached out to and said. And I remember David approaching us and said, hey, "Could you guys? I know you guys go on humanitarian missions. Could you test out our prototypes for us?" So back then, and the crisis we responded to was the Malaysian floods in Kelantan. So we went out to Kelantan, and we agreed, and we actually brought with us. We had the luck with us their prototype, which is a big, heavy glass case of ceramic membranes, heavy, but it was effective because, and the Malaysians were amazed because after we connected the pipes, the dirty water goes in. Then turn on the tap, wow, we have clean water. And we had to encourage them to use it. So what do? We put our cup, contain the water, and drag it in front of them. Yeah, to tell them that, hey, this is safe water, and you can drink it. So those were days, it was a very heavy thing. And well, Water Room has progressed, and now their water filters are not that heavy anymore.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so in fact, just two of us, to bring 20 water filters to Turkey. So thanks to the Turkish embassy. We invited one of them to come tonight, but I think
He might be here later. Let's
he
see.
might be here later, but yeah. And then with the help of Turkish Airlines also, we managed to bring the water filters over. Much lighter than before, and it's in a box, And one, should I go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So one other story I want to share is, in fact, so in Turkey, our main mission was water filters, correct? And then we had the postcards things. And because Relief Singapore, one of the things that we do is psychosocial support through sports. So like in Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, we actually did badminton sessions with the Rohingya children. So and I play badminton, I love badminton. So that's one of the reasons why we use. I mean, there's so many sports, right? You've got to choose one, right? So what do you choose? Exactly, no brainer. So being a badminton enthusiast, on Turkey trip, I brought a bag, badminton bag. Of course, I checked that in. I did not hand carry 6 rackets, some shuttlecocks, even a portable net. So I brought it along, hoping to find an opportunity to pass it to them and to let them play. And because actually mental health is a very important issue. So just now you're asking who wants to, when you start an NGO, what would you want to do? You have water, you have shelter. Mental health is another important thing, which is often ignored. Yeah, and of course the main things would be food, healthcare, water filters, protection, right? But mental health is so important as well, especially for children. So I brought it along, and I remember it was the last deployment. We installed a water filter in this particular village in Turkey, and then there were kids there, right? And then we were sitting down. The locals were very appreciative. They made us Turkish tea, so we were all sitting around having our tea. And then I looked at the children, the kids, and then they were coming out, and then guess what were they holding? Table tennis, bats, and one of them was just like playing with it a bit with the ball. I was wondering, where are they going to play table tennis in an earthquake zone? And later I found out from them when I asked them, there's no table for them to play. So they were probably just going to hit to each other. So I didn't know that, right? But then I saw them, okay, they're taking out their table tennis bats. Okay, I think it's time for me to take out my badminton rackets. Yes, let's go, So I brought it out. They were like, all right. I told them, come. So we went to the side street, and then so I started pulling out, and they loved it. Yeah, so they enjoyed playing. I think they're still playing with it. So we gave them everything: the bag, the portable nets. Yeah. So look for opportunities. So even if you're involved in missions and you're doing something, the main thing, see whether you can do a side thing. Sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. It's okay. For now.
And I think Jonathan brings up a very important point because, especially in these circumstances, I mean, we all know more nowadays, obviously, because everything is practically live, being reported. The fact that, a lot of survivors suffered psychologically. They were lying next to their dead relatives. The children were survived, surrounded by their dead parents, and only rescued much later. So this kind of social psychological support is extremely important for their long-term recovery. And for the NGO partners that we work with, it's not just for the victims, they also would provide that for the helpers. For the first responders who see the worst things, they also need support so that they can continue carrying on. So they will cycle through, usually weekly or fortnightly, to give them time to recover before they go back in again. So these are things that are extremely important in terms of a humanitarian response.
I'm glad you mentioned the mental health of the people who are helping the people, because that was what I experienced also in Turkey. Because I have a friend, a Turkish friend who works in an NGO, and it's actually an Irish NGO, but they have a presence in Turkey. It's called, what's it called? Okay, I forgot. Getting old. But so Irish NGO, so she's based there, and I was in touch with her. People, I knew her through a training course, and everyone in the course were messaging her, hey, are you okay? And so she told us a story that she had to run out of my house, and thank God she was okay. But a lot of their colleagues were not. In fact, at the end of everything, I think it's 30 over of this NGO's workers, they died. And I found out from her that it's really tough for them. They were living in the cars, they were blankets, no houses, right? So even 8 workers themselves had to deal with it. And as if that's not bad enough for themselves, they have to work almost 24 hours, 24 by 7, helping the people that they're supposed to help. So it's really tough for them. I think people leave, people,
Burnout.
it's burnout. It's
Are
quite-
these eight workers like volunteers or are they paid?
These, a lot of workers are staff, so they are professional aid workers. But even later on, so if there are volunteers coming on board and they are helping out, I've worked with the NGOs over there on the ground, and they have volunteers coming from different parts of Turkey, and they are also like working at the kind of same pace as the aid workers. Yeah, so they were tired out as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough.
So this goes back to the point, right? When we talk about first responders, we tend to think about firefighters, police, nurses, and all that. First responders are whoever is actually there, which means that some of these are not professionally trained to deal with trauma, and they need to be supported as well. Right? So these are quite a few of the different aspects of humanitarian aid response that we'd like to surface in tonight's conversation. And please throw us questions if you have. But I did want to bring up a very interesting one that we had to deal with quite recently in both Australia and New Zealand in Cyclone Gabrielle, which had unprecedented floods in New Zealand. And we had flying experts. So when you think of search and rescue people, what do you think of? Just shout it out.
Canine, donkey.
Yeah.
Doggies. Okay, I like doggies. What else?
Fireman.
Firemen, very good. Right? Huh? First aid responders. I tell you what. Who did we fly in? We flew in Team Rubicon from Canada, right? And what were they specialized in? They were arborists.
Morris.
So they know how to cut trees.
Okay.
Because you need to clear the path for the vehicles to get through. So these are experts. Trust me, I think all of us in this room, if we had to, I'm not sure we know how to wield a chainsaw safely to save our own lives, never mind other people's lives. So they were in there to clear the debris. But because they're arborists, they also can obviously examine the tree and look at the tree, which looks perfectly fine, and they can say, it looks fine, but the roots are now affected. And in about 3 months' time, this is going to collapse on those refugee tents. So we need to clear that too. Right? So these are things that we don't necessarily think about. And more, we are seeing unprecedented disasters, very intense storms, very intense cyclones, so we call super cyclones, super typhoons, like Typhoon Rai that hit the Philippines. We have had an unprecedented 3-year La Nina as well, which means in Singapore we've been quite fortunate 3 years without the annual haze. Am I right? Guess what? They still burn. It's just that the haze doesn't reach us because we had intense rains by the La Nina. We are now in El Nino. So we can expect, more intense disasters compared to the past. And as I mentioned about Cyclone Freddy, if Cyclone Freddy picked up speed and strength in a La Nina year to cross from Northeast Australia to hit Africa, we can imagine what that's going to be like, as the world gets warmer and warmer. Okay, so what we all do together here is extremely important. We share our experiences. A lot of experiences are also quite new because they're unprecedented disasters. Learning from each other and being more prepared all the time for what might come next. So I actually have a term for this. Hang on, let me try and pull it up. Because when we're planning for it, I was telling my teammates, right? There are what we call known knowns, right? Known knowns would be things like monsoon seasons, typhoon seasons. We know Merapi is always active. We can anticipate volcanic eruptions and therefore earthquakes. Those are the known knowns, right? Then there are what we call the unknown knowns. We know there's climate change. We just never anticipated the extent of it in Pakistan. It was glacial melt. Adding to the monsoon rain, which made all these unprecedented floods, the soils are already so saturated they could not drain fast enough, and therefore the riverbanks and all that were flooded. So, we know there's climate change, we just didn't expect the scale of this, and therefore the response is unpredictable. And of course, we have the unknown unknowns, all the black swan events. I don't think anyone would have expected Afghanistan to be in this state right now, nor for that matter, Sudan, right? Or, of course, in Ukraine, we're probably planning a play date or planning to propose to your girlfriend, and then suddenly you woke up in the middle of the night and you're at war. So those are things that we more or less know happens in our world today. And collectively, there are professional NGOs all prepared to respond. The humanitarian aid sector is a very underfunded sector. Right? There's never enough money. It's so little money, it's not funny. And therefore, we see the generosity of people. We saw it obviously in the Turkey response in Singapore. But if only people had responded to support the NGOs that are already out there doing that work. We have those 139 tons waiting to be shipped in. So I'm going to throw the floor to questions because I think we've spoken enough. And anyone wants to have a question or speak up, please stick up your hand.
Where are you headquartered?
So Airlink is headquartered in DC, Washington, DC. And like I said, it was created out of a disaster, the Haiti earthquake. Interestingly enough, a lot of NGOs are created out of an earthquake, after an earthquake response.
Why is that so?
Because they realize that they need to step in and help.
But only after an earthquake or why?
Usually it's after, because it's very visceral. You can respond to something you see. If I tell you now El Nino is going to happen, it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. Right? But you see like lava coming down the mountain and burning villages, you know what you're supposed to do, right? So in the case of Philippines, for example, PDRF, the Philippine Disaster Resilience Forum, which is our partner, they responded to Super Typhoon. Japan platform responded to Typhoon Rai, also in the Philippines, because they had sent aid and they were circling around the coast because they couldn't get in to help, and they were, because they were responding, and the Filipino Coast Guard also came out to find out what they were doing. So actually, a lot of NGOs are created in the wake of a disaster. In the case of Japan platform as well, they were responding to the early Afghan war, and then they realized that just a few of them, individuals with a compassionate heart, they were still not organized and coordinated enough. Yeah.
So would you say that you work, there's constantly, because I think we all realize in a rich world, the prioritized disasters are not the same. Like, for example, we hear about the floods in New Zealand, but in Singapore, you barely hear about the cyclone Freddy in Malawi. So would you say you're working actually there is a disaster happening every single day?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So there's usually a natural disaster or a prolonged conflict.
I'm supposed to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, I will repeat the question. Yeah, so the question is, a lot of disasters are obviously not visible, right? You don't hear about it, you don't read about it. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I come from journalism, by the way. My background is in journalism. And the media world is also underfunded and under-resourced. So that is also why you don't hear so much about a lot of these events. Okay? I'm sure Ryan will be able to tell us, all of us are monitoring. It's, I was just we're looking at the cyclone Mawa that has hit Guam, which we're all monitoring as well. So there's always something happening all the time. Go and Google Zoom Earth and you'll see cyclones building up at sea, which we are watching quite closely.
Right. So would you say you're like a weather expert by now because you watch like the weather report on a daily basis?
If you expect me to be in that raincoat on television, holding the umbrella, the answer is no. There are more effective ways to work. And one of the more effective ways, exactly that. So we constantly have calls. We have calls with FAO, we have calls with the World Food Programme, we're watching, we're anticipating, if the cyclone is going to hit and wipe out the harvest, how do we then prevent this? Should we then store seeds, in a safe place and make sure that the moment it's passed, it can plant again and prevent food insecurity? So there are things that we obviously anticipated. It's a very complex world, and obviously some places are more difficult to get to than others. Okay, so we can speak off camera on that.
Actually, that was what I wanted to ask. Can you tell us about the most challenging or most difficult, or one of the most difficult areas that you've actually worked in? Is it like, do you think it's like war that makes it more difficult than natural disasters?
No.
Yeah.
I think all of them, whether it's a conflict, domestic, violence or natural disasters, they all have their degrees of difficulty. But we just had one that is actually quite a complex one because we were shipping medical aid to Papua New Guinea. So it's a highly remote place, and also she's a nurse that advocates for a community in the highlands. So obviously she's alone and she cannot come down as well in a conflict area. So this is, a delivery that involved, if I hope I don't misquote, but I think it involved 4 countries, 5 airlines, 18 pickup points, and with volunteers carrying it on backpack into the high mountains.
Wow.
So it's taken us a few months to get it to her. So there are obviously challenges. If you look at the Pacific Islands, for instance, it's very challenging because if you look at Vanuatu, for example, there's 320,000 people living in 80 islands. So some islands might have only a few thousand people, but you still need to bring that aid out there. You still need to get the water filters out there because the storm has contaminated their lakes and water supplies. So it's, the cost per capita of getting aid to them is extremely high. But it's not just the cost, it's the difficulty. So if you look at places like America, whether north or south, in theory, you can fly there, you can truck there, you can take a rail there, right? You can technically go from Alaska to Del Fuego. You can also technically go from Lisbon all the way to Kamchatka in Russia. I don't see how we're going to get from Osaka to New Zealand, from Guam to Afghanistan because of the logistics, right? So within Southeast Asia, for example, we have to deal with a lot of challenges, not just air, because there are little places, but they are not able to handle the big planes, or remote areas where it's like small planes, helicopters even, or poor roads. Trucking is very difficult. Islands that are very hard to reach. So pelagic, open oceans, very hard to reach areas. So there are lots of challenges, different kinds of challenges. And of course, there are other challenges like refugee crisis, right? Especially the refugees in a different country. There's a host country hosting those refugees. So, Ryan, do you have anything to share you want to talk about for UNHCR?
For the displacement of the refugees?
Yeah,
Yeah, sure. Come on out.
Should I let him?
Oh, don't worry, sit. I've got nothing much to say. But you can clip this on.
This for recording.
Yes.
Yeah, that's for recording.
Okay.
It's very fun.
Clip
It's
it
very
on the
funky.
collar.
A collar.
Yeah, so that you can pick up the
So it doesn't. Can you help me with this? Okay.
So while he's doing that,
Thank
I'm
you.
actually going to check on my disaster alerts.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan. I'm from the UNHCR. You may not be familiar with this UN agency because in Singapore we don't see any refugees around. But it does mean they are not out there. So UNHCR stands for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We were established in 1950, right after the Second World War. The mandate back then was to assist European refugees. And the mandate was supposed to only last for 3 years. But who knows? One conflict led to another. So we've been around ever since.
So here we are.
Yeah, it's been more than 70 years. Yeah. So our agency has actually won 2 Nobel Peace prizes in 1951 and 1974. Yeah, for our humanitarian work. So we are present in 140 countries. In my agency alone, we employ about 20,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you need a job, let me know. Just kidding. So, I like my boss and I belong to the 10% of fortunate white collar employees, whereas the 90% of our colleagues are actually working on the ground. They are called protection officers. They're working with refugees, doing the hard and dirty work. So our role in Singapore and regionally would be to mobilize resources. So we work very closely with corporates, foundations, philanthropists, and also ultra high net worth individuals who have an interest in philanthropy. Yeah. So why am I here today? Because besides cash donations, we also accept gifts in kind, GIK. We are constantly looking for partners who can provide free freight services. Yeah, because we have 7 strategically located warehouses across the world, so we can deploy supplies very quickly. Within 72 hours, we can cater to about 750,000.
Where are your warehouses located?
Oh, okay. Let me look it up.
Oh, okay.
No, it's all over.
Oh, it's top secret. Sorry.
I can answer some of that.
Really? Okay, go ahead.
So they have warehouses in Kuala Lumpur, Suva in Fiji, in Brisbane in Australia. Yeah, so there
Let me
are
verify.
Yeah, there are quite a few warehouses where that's why there's a quick response.
Yep.
And that's why we also say, try to not have public donations because there are already goods available. And because we know where they're coming from, we are able to secure not so much free flights, but what we call also in-kind donation. So when airlines have excess capacity or donated miles that we can use to get seats quickly, that's how we get all these people and cargo out quickly. But we still have to pay some kind of cost because it's not fair to the airlines, and that's where we raise funds to meet that need. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
So if airlines are not flying to a disaster area because there's war or it's closed, how do you can't actually pay for anything because no one is flying?
We will find a way by trucking or some kind. Oh, sorry. The question is, how do you get? The question that was asked from the floor is, if an airline doesn't fly to the place where there is a conflict or a disaster, how do we get it there? The answer is that we work with our logistics partners to somehow get it closest. Or if even it's not the case, like the airline cannot get there because the infrastructure is damaged, right? Or the quite a few cases we've seen where the tarmac is cracked from an earthquake or damaged by a tsunami and you can't land. We'll still get it to the closest possible point and then we truck it over. So that's why we always say the last mile is the most challenging because it is a disaster zone. Yeah. Any other things you want to talk about? Okay, I'm gonna have a question for you. So, at this moment, which are the biggest refugee crises in the world? Can you talk a little bit about them?
Sure. So we have currently the hot topic will be like Sudan. So the Sudanese emergency is unfortunately underreported. So we're trying to draw more attention on that front. Of course, the Ukraine emergency, all of us know already. So lately, we also deal with the cyclone Morka, which is affecting Bangladesh and Myanmar. Yeah.
How many people are in the Rohingya camps? Tell them
I don't
about
have the statistics.
Okay. So basically, when he talks about cyclone Morka for Bangladesh and Myanmar, it's because there are a lot of Rohingya refugees at the moment. So the Rohingya crisis is quite serious. In Bangladesh, for example, they are hosted in the Cox's Bazar area. And that was actually in line of the cyclone. Thankfully, it missed. Or it wasn't as strong as anticipated. However, that is currently the largest refugee camp in the world. Right? So again, do you hear about it enough? Possibly not.
Is there? Go for it first.
So you work in some countries that are notoriously not necessarily friendly. How much red tape are you dealing with?
Yeah, some countries are notoriously difficult. How do we work there, and how much red tape do you deal with? So the answer to that, I think we all saw in the Turkey-Syria earthquake. We saw that there was a lot of response, but trying to get aid into Syria was very challenging. And therefore, the alternative was to get it to the Turkey-Syrian border and get it over to Syria. So there are challenges like this. We are currently facing difficulties as well, trying to get aid into the Rakhine state, where Cyclone Mocha has, affected the communities. We do have NGOs that are always working on the ground, even in the crisis. So there will be ways to reach out to them, and we have reached out to them to find out how we can get aid across. So they will have to negotiate with the government because they live there, and then we'll somehow try to get aid across. So again, it's very challenging, but I think it behooves all of us to come together to find some solutions. Yeah. Sorry, I think Daphne had the question.
Yeah. So just wondering because like Cox's Bazar has been there for like ages, right? And it's usually, they're obviously located in an area where it's not the best, and it's in the direct.
You should just speak to the.
Oh, yeah.
You want to sit here? I'm done.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, he's off.
Yeah. Off the hook.
I'm grabbing my drink in the meantime.
Yeah. No, actually, my question was really, I think everyone knows of Cox's Bazar and they're quite infamous as a refugee camp, but is anyone doing anything to like move them out of the line of the cyclone because it gets hit? I'm sure this is not going to be the first time, and why are they still located where they are located? They're huge, but are there people looking to move them to a better area or split this camp up? Yeah.
Can't answer for, I was not on the ground.
Oh, yeah.
But there were attempts to move them because, maybe.
Maybe you can answer.
Come back up here. There were attempts to relocate them to somewhere safer. I might add though, this is a very large camp. It was not easy to move that many people that quickly out of the path of a massive cyclone. But I'll let Jonathan speak about this because he's been trying to get aid there and we've been trying to get him there.
To Rakhine,
Yes.
we're trying to work with Airlink to see whether we can get to Rakhine, which is tough to get in. So that's Myanmar side, but we have been in Cox's Bazar since 2018. So your question was, is anybody doing anything, right? So that's why the Bangladesh government tried to move. I think they're trying to move about 10% of the Cox's Bazar, the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar to an island. It's called Basan Char. But this island, it's sinking, perhaps. But 10 years ago, this island wasn't there. So it's actually built up from silt. So it's near the bay. So it came out. It's called Basan Char, and the government decided that we're going to fortify this place. We're going to make it inhabitable. Is that right? Okay. And then we're going to move 10%. They truly wanted to. We got to give them some credit, okay? That they wanted to prevent, because the camps, there are 34 camps in Cox's Bazar, and very crowded, very bad situation. Sanitary conditions are bad. And yes, every year when the floods, the monsoon season, people will be affected. There will be some landslides, some people die, people injured, lose their homes. Don't even start on the fires that happen in the camps very often. So they truly wanted to move at least some people out, at least the more vulnerable ones. So Basan Char is there, and I think they have not reached 100,000 yet, but there are people living there. But there is negative and also positive feedback about living there, on a man-made island.
I think also just to add on to that, there are some problems that are obviously intractable. It's not up to us to solve. Right? They need higher level policies and so forth. In fact, if you go back even to climate change, right? People talking about policies, decarbonization, sustainable travel, blah, blah, blah. That is also a very long-term thing. People need to come together, sign agreements, bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements and so forth. But in the meantime, disasters are still happening. climate refugees are still being created every single day. So in the case of the Pacific Islands, for example, the risk, of course, of rising seawater is that all the nuclear waste that's been stored there since World War II will be exposed. Then what happens, right? The seed bank, for example, up in Norway is also being now at risk because they're now exposed as the snow melts. So there's some problems, obviously, that are rather intractable. It's not up to us. So I think in terms of exactly what we do, it's just being aware of it and the more short-term and immediate response and thinking more of the long-term recovery. So recovery might include, for example, we've spoken about this, psychosocial support, especially for children growing up in refugee camps or conflict areas. And obviously also to somehow build resilience so that there's some kind of local recovery in terms of jobs, ways they can make livelihoods and therefore be more resilient. Your question?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Easier if we just spoke into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think Mike knows
Yeah.
why.
I got the mic. Oh my
Yes,
God.
you get the mic. Yeah.
Actually, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm Tim. Actually, I used to work very closely with the ERT team in DHL,
Ah,
which I
Tell them what
does a lot of
ERT
work
means.
with y'all.
Oh yeah.
It's the emergency response team. So DHL actually sponsors a mini fleet of planes that when there is a disaster, they will fly the planes. But not only that, they set up in the airports and they work with the airports where they think there will be a disaster already to try and get the logistics in place for preparing for the disaster when it occurs. Yeah, which like Morocco or something. Like you mentioned before, there's a lot of places which you can kind of predict there will be something at some point. It's just a question of when, right? So they just get ready in these areas. But my question was actually more for your experience with the water filters and maybe and just to focus more on the Airlink because you're flying everything and then this thing has to get cleared through customs or some sort of customs regime thing. And does Airlink services, I mean, especially for fellas that, hey man, I just want to get these water filters over there. I'm not a, I don't have a buyer over there. There's no consignee for this, So do y'all have like some sort of brokerage service that you're like, kind of like getting all this stuff in, or is that an Airlink service, or is that something that y'all still have to work with specialists with? And the second question is, before you get back to Mike, have you ever worked with? I reckon maybe you have worked with partners like. It's not. I don't know if they're a partner or not, but there's companies like SOS International that that right now they're going to all the remote places in the world, primarily because that's where they're helping people mine things or get oil and things like that. They're just very remote, but they're used to getting things to remote places. And is that the kind of partner y'all work with?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll hand it over.
so I'm trying to remember. The first question was the regulations, right? The brokerage. So that's why we work with logistics partners and ground handlers who are able to help this. But also the coordination on the international level, we have what we call the logistics cluster calls, and we work very closely with people on the ground. So in the case of Turkey, Syria, for example, I have 2 separate chat groups, and the people on the ground, they're always checking with us, make sure these forms are being filled. What kind of medicines are coming in? What kind of clearance do you have from your own country? And all these are in Turkish or Syrian. So we're working with people to make sure that they are properly cleared and the forms are properly, filled out so that it gets through. On the other side, is there a consignee that will receive it and vouch for it and make sure it leaves the airport or the warehouse and not clogging up space. So in terms of the actual minutiae of people, of things arriving, things being loaded on the planes to begin with. So we recently had a case where it was a smaller aircraft than expected. So the pallets that had already been packed by the NGO had to be repacked because it couldn't go to the cargo door. Or it could go through this cargo door, but the next stage it would not get on, and that's not their job, right? So we actually think through all of this as much as possible so that it's seamless because we're stitching a lot of points together before it actually gets to the final destination. So I don't know whether that answers your questions. We do work with partners. So the partnership model is crucial. Working with partners, NGO partners like Relief SG that we vet and understand what they do. Working with airline partners who have the city pairs that help us to move goods to where they need to be. And logistics partners that are very familiar with the markets that they already work with because they're already there doing commercial goods, right? They are for profit, all these companies, but because they're familiar with it and they're donating their time and expertise, to companies like ourselves, NGOs, they know how to help us move it quickly. So example would be lithium batteries. So in disaster response, we have companies that use drones to observe large areas, obviously looking for people stranded in trees and on roofs, fires, for example, but they have lithium batteries. So we will have to figure out, declare it, and make sure that they are safe to be carried across. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's like, is there like do you have a broker?
Do we have a broker?
Like
No.
a broker partner?
No, we have many partners in different parts of the world because of all the challenges that you've mentioned. So there is no one platform, is there, that answers all the different regulations of each country around the world. But again, it comes back to if we had the partners, we're prepared, and therefore when disaster strikes, we're more ready. So on a segue, before we go to your second question, we are having a training program next month in the Philippines, and it's at Clark. Right? So what's very interesting about it is that they anticipate there could be a big disaster that would take out Manila. So they actually have set up this whole preparation where it's going to be at Clark. They have uninterrupted power supply for 48 hours if they have a national blackout. That will keep things going. So these are the kind of things that people think through, right? So I just came back from a conference of humanitarian aid agencies. And one of the topics that was highly interesting was they were talking about water. So we think about a few things. And when we talk about preparation, we talk about agriculture, how it affects, because that affects food security, water, and we talk about energy. So one of the interesting things was then a lady from Mexico pointed to me and said, but you guys do water so well, and talked about the Singapore's APC program, Active, Beautiful and Clean. Right? So if you think about it, that is a very good example of preparation because we know one day that water contract will end in 2060 and we prepared for it. So you don't think of it as a disaster preparedness or mitigation, but it is a long-term response to a known outcome. Right? So this is my long way of saying, right, if we know that all these are issues, we anticipate and then we start preparing and build partnerships. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. And your second question was? SOS International and all that, right?
Because
So
it's a very private company.
correct. So he was supposed to be here tonight.
Well, really?
Yes, I invited Michael Komosimo here.
Was
Yes, he was supposed to be here tonight. And of course, you know him from DHL Express and doing the emergency response teams. So yes, we work with as many partners as is feasible for situations like this. So for example, in the case of Malawi, before Cyclone Freddy hit, we knew that there was a cholera outbreak already. And with Cyclone Freddy hits, they will be exacerbating that particular problem. So we know, for example, that after 3 years of La Nina, a lot of communities in Australia wouldn't have had the chance to clear the underbush, which means when El Nino comes, we're going to have raging wildfires. So there are, to a degree, the things you can anticipate, and then you can, start to prepare for it before it gets worse. This goes back to what I talked about the Mongolian zoot, the drought. If we saw it coming and we saw there was a protracted drought, then what happens? Now, if El Nino comes, ironically, rain is going to come to the Horn of Africa, which has been in drought for 7 years. We all know when there's a drought, the earth is dry and cracked, and if rainfall comes, then it's going to actually create other problems. So the key to all of this is actually information sharing, transparency. We're on calls quite regularly, and we're on calls regularly either on a particular issue like El Nino. So we're still undecided yet. What are the chances of a full-blown El Nino? The only thing that's quite clear at the moment is below average rainfall for Indonesia up to July. So what does it mean for the crops, for the agriculture, for food security? Those are things that we are all already thinking about. So, then we have calls about logistics clusters, and, we are fully prepared. Our warehouse is stocked. We are short of this and short of that. Yeah. So I hope that answers it. Jonathan?
Yeah.
Ching-Ling? Can you grab the mic, come? Then I don't have to
Yeah.
repeat it.
Yes, we wrote about.
It's for the recording.
It's for the recording, it's the record.
How much do you work with air forces in different countries? Different countries, yeah.
Does it mean military, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the government response. So in terms of a disaster response, there are quite a few actors. So the NDMOs, as we call them, is the National Disaster Mitigation Officers, the government level. And usually, as we saw in the case of Singapore, the Singapore Civil Defence Forces left for Turkey. So there's the NDMOs that are responding, then the international NGOs, right, the UN agencies and so forth. Then we have the smaller national NGOs, but they're also very small, like Jonathan Relief SG, a few volunteers and so forth. So there are different actors like this, and more we're trying to involve the private sector because they are actually very crucial to the local community. A lot of them are businesses that are in country, on the ground, and been there for a long time. So the key here is actually coordination. But when you mention the military, so that is something that the governments have also recognized because it's a ready-to-go, obviously, package. Normally you see what the National Guard in some countries, for example, they respond. The military, for example, in Philippines or Indonesia would respond. So because they have enough bodies, obviously, and the access and equipment to respond. So in the case of Singapore, there is what we call the RHCC, which is a Regional HARDR Coordination Center with 20 military in touch with each other. And one of the reasons is to prevent conflict, right? Because, if you are responding with military equipment, you do not want to create a wrong impression. There's a lot of coordination and work together. And also, it's a large-scale response when necessary. We saw that in the Aceh disaster, 2004, when a lot of navies responded because, obviously, the earthquake was the worst ever in history. And the response was mounted off the coast, and navies responded. And speaking of navies responding, that also created a psychological response for the survivors of the tsunami to see the Navy vessels out there, because this was a place that was, under civil war for many years. And they suddenly saw the whole fleet out there. It actually was another secondary trauma for them. I don't know whether that answers your question. Yeah, to a degree? Yeah, go ahead. Yes, you.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I just have a quick question. Do you guys work with charities at all? The Caritas Humanitarian Aid?
Mhm.
Yeah, just curious.
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I can be persuaded. Partner with me.
I'm going with them for a mission next year.
Okay.
So I will be in contact.
Yay!
Okay, so-
that would be great.
So just to be clear, Airlink does disaster response. Okay, so we do a lot of preparation for disasters rather than development kind of stuff. But anyway, that's a good question as well.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
How do you get into this field in Singapore? And also, do you work with the MFA? And how so?
Okay. So again, coming back to working with MFA, so that's the government side. In all responses, we respond when the governments welcome us. We need to work with governments so that we have access, we have the tax exemptions. Hopefully, we have a green lane to move all the products in quickly. So that's a broader question rather than a broader answer rather than a narrow answer. How did I get into this? So Ching-Ling and I were ex-colleagues. We were journalists. And For better or for worse, we journalists cover a lot of things, including man-made disasters, terror attacks, as well as natural disasters, which means we see it all. So we see a lot of this. I was in Indonesia as a bureau chief for Bloomberg. There were 4 civil wars going on at that time. There were a lot of terror attacks, bombings all the time. And of course, natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. So there are things that as a journalist, once you see, you cannot unsee. And I think that is what motivates you. There are things you really cannot unsee. You cannot, in good conscience, go through life knowing what happens in a disaster and not doing something about it. So the short answer to that is what motivates me. In the case of the Aceh tsunami, it was a double trauma because this was a place that was under a civil war since 1975. So they are not used to seeing their own countrymen, let alone a whole global phalanx of people and faces descending upon them and trying to offer them help. It was so traumatic for them. They didn't know what to do. And then people were saying, oh, but there's money out there, there are pledges, they're like 9 billion pledged for you. What does that mean to them? They have no clue what that means. So using my journalistic skills, I took my own time off. I went to the ground. I brought 500 sarongs with me. Sarongs are extremely useful, I might add. It's something that's culturally recognizable, that they use. Both genders can use it. And you can use it whether you're fat, you're thin, you're pregnant, everything.
One size fits all.
Exactly. You hang the tubular sarong on the tree that becomes your shower. Right? You put it in the bush that becomes your toilet. Right? You have a child that becomes a carrier. And when it's time to move from one refugee camp to another refugee camp, that's where you pack your things and go. So I brought 500 sarongs with me. And then I went and interviewed people. So this was my superpower. My skill was to interview people. And I interviewed them to try and figure out what do you need. And I wrote the grant applications for them. And then that's how I fundraised for them. And that was my personal experience as a reporter in Aceh. And of course, what you witnessed firsthand. So one of the motivating factors was that for, a quarter of a century of the Civil War, we got news from Aceh, from the Serambi News Agency, and it was wiped out. The moment we did not hear of a casualty for like the first 45 minutes, we knew it was a major disaster because we should hear it. So we flew in. So it became my personal tribute to the journalists who died, to do the job that they would normally have done. So what was very moving, just as a personal note, was that there's a tree next to Serambi News Agency. All the branches were stripped off. There's only a trunk and a few stumps left. And despite the disaster, people straggled up and they hung pencils as a tribute to those who died. Because they knew they had, been talking about the plight for the last quarter of a century. So anyway, so that's what I did. I interviewed a lot of different NGOs and what kind of help they needed. And it was actually a life-changing experience for me because there are problems, obviously, that he tried to surface. But then, as journalists, we asked more and more questions, and there were a lot of underlying problems as well that we surfaced. So I'll give you one example. There were 300 children that were moved from coastal schools that had been destroyed into inland schools. The coastal schools have a secular curriculum. The inland schools were the madrasas. But also life experience-wise, the mountain children had no clue what the sea is and what the tsunami is. And the coastal children who play in the beaches had no clue why the river runs still. So it was, in that respect, the psychosocial trauma that they suffered. But also children being children, when they saw these strange kids coming out, they were like, tsunami kids, And so it was doubling their trauma. So one of the things that, as a community, I was interviewing them, they suggested was, let's make uniforms for them, but for all of them, not just for the tsunami kids. So now they're all mixing together in the same uniform, so it equalizes them. But to make 600 sets of uniforms times 2 was quite a challenge. So they recruited the women because then that gave them something to do and take their mind off losing their own children. They could now make uniforms for other children. And they could cook for the children in these expanded grounds, the camps and all that. So that was a long answer to your question, because once you see these things, you learn so much in such a short time and you can't unsee it. You know what the situation is on the ground. And so you know it's being replicated, when we hear of Cyclone Mocha or this or that, the other, then how could you not help? Yeah.
Then how does one, so example, like any of us, how do we get into this field?
Okay, so the question is, how does any of us get into this field? I think, we all have different capacities, obviously. When it's time to volunteer, when you reach out to Jonathan, there are lots of NGOs helping. But also, like I said, I think the crucial thing for us in disaster response is the first 72 hours. We hope to raise as much funds as possible and make sure that all the supplies that are already in the 7 logistics centers go. Let's go. They can go so quickly. Let's get there quickly. We can worry about the rest in the next stage. The next stage will be the next 2 weeks. And then we look at the 3-month response, because in that time, as already seen in Gaziantep and Adana, they are starting to move. Once they have cleared the debris, that's not a place for them to stay, they will move. So there is a medium-term response to every stage of the disaster. So in terms of helping, I think number one is that there are actually websites like relief.web.int, which tells you of all the disasters that are happening around the world. So at least you know how bad Cyclone Freddy was, how bad Cyclone Mocha was, and the things that you can do. So I think like all things in life, right, the more well-read you are, the more aware you are, then you can help. And my job is to make people aware that the logistics of aid is the one thing that people don't talk about. Yeah?
Yeah.